Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com.
Thank you for joining Community IT for this podcast, Part 1. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits. Listen for Part 2 in your podcast feed.
I'm going to hand it over to our presenters, Johan Hammerstrom, who is the Chief Operating Officer, and Matthew Eshleman, who is the Chief Technology Officer.
All right. Thank you very much, Roshni, and welcome to everyone here joining us this afternoon for the webinar. We're happy to have you with us. And as Roshni mentioned, we're going to be talking about IT planning today. So we'll get that started. So we're going to be covering 4 sort of larger areas related to IT planning. The first is governance. And before you hit the cancel button to get out of the webinar, we promise to keep that relatively short. And we're going to specifically talk about governance in the context of IT planning and sort of the critical importance that governance issues play in having a successful IT planning process. From there, we'll move on and talk a little bit more about strategy and how you can build and incorporate a successful strategy into your IT planning, and also how you can align your planning process with your overall organizational strategy. An important part of any IT planning process is to understand what you currently have in place in your organization with regards to information technology. And so assessing the current state of your IT is also a very important part of IT planning. And then finally, we'll discuss some sort of concrete budget guidelines, some tangible factors that you can that you want to keep in mind, and that can also be used sort of as a tool for helping you put together an IT budget, which is kind of in some ways, the concrete, deliverable or end result of an IT planning process. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about governance here. Cool. So before we get into that, though, I did want to have this one kind of affirmation. And sometimes, if you're the only person responsible for IT in your organization, or even if you're, part of a small IT team in a larger organization, it can be hard to kind of, explain to others the value of technology. And I think that the first thing to recognize in any IT planning process is that technology is important. And as our world becomes, increasingly dominated by information technology, it's increasingly important for organizations to have good IT planning and good IT strategy in order for them to succeed. So we're happy that all of you could join us today, and we just wanted to kind of affirm that for you. And a part of what we're going to be covering in this webinar today is ways that you can kind of take that understanding of the importance of technology and share that with the rest of your organization and get other people in the organization on board with the IT planning process. So before we get started, we kind of want to get a sense of the size of organizations that are represented. So we're going to go ahead and launch a poll. Just let us know how many staff are in your organization. The organization either that you represent or if you're a consultant, organizations that you typically work with. And it's looking like we have a pretty even distribution, about a third in each category. No one here from an organization with over 100 staff, but it's about a third from each category. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of speak to the needs of each kind of size profile that's represented here, and certainly ask questions as we go along using the question box. So let's talk a little bit about governance. So what do we mean by governance? And I pulled this definition from the IT Governance Institute, and they revised their definition of IT governance back in last year, 2012. And they said that governance are the essentials that ensure that IT sustains and extends the mission of the organization. So good governance means that certain essential factors are in place such that IT can support and extend the mission of the organization. So what are those essential factors? Well, it kind of boils down to three things. First, leadership. Leadership is critical, and if leadership is not on board on some level with the understanding that IT is important, if leadership is not engaged on some level with the IT planning process, then it's unlikely to succeed. It's certainly unlikely to succeed on sort of a bigger picture strategic level, but it's also potentially likely to fail on more of a tactical operational level. So leadership needs to be on board, and I realize that that's not always the case. Sometimes you're working in a situation where leadership is not engaged in the process, and we're going to spend a little bit of time later on in the webinar talking about some different ways that you can engage leadership. But if you're responsible for IT planning in any way, you need to include that as kind of one of your critical goals or tasks. You need to get the leadership engaged at some level. Second, you need to have organizational structures that support the proper functioning of IT, support of IT. Someone needs to own IT within the organization. The best way to do that is to actually have a named position like an IT director or a CIO, and certainly in larger organizations, that's an important position to establish and to staff effectively. In small organizations, particularly in the 0 to 20 organizations with less than 20 staff, it's unlikely that you will have someone whose sole responsibility is for IT. Generally, you have people who wear a lot of different hats. But even so, you need to make it, someone needs to be responsible for it, someone with a certain level of managerial authority. So oftentimes, we've seen that work with an office manager or an operations manager, kind of takes IT on. Certainly, it's not uncommon for someone in the finance function of the organization, like a VP of Finance, Director of Finance, to take that on as well. It just needs to be clear, and that person also needs to take that responsibility seriously. And then finally, in order for there to be good governance around IT, you need to have processes in place. And the sophistication of the process really kind of depends on the size and complexity of the organization. So, for a small organization, the processes might be, as simple as we're going to do an assessment 4 months before our budget is due, and then we'll have a meeting to discuss IT priorities 2 months after that, and then the budget will be due 1 month after that. And that's a pretty basic, straightforward process. But having that as an organizational process is really important in making sure that the IT planning happens effectively. As the size and complexity of the organization grows, the processes also become more complicated. And certainly as for larger organizations, starting to get the board involved, the board of directors involved on IT planning at some level is also important for good governance. So these are all critical parts of putting together a successful IT plan. So let's talk a little bit more about what to do if your leadership is disengaged with IT, doesn't care about it, doesn't have time for it, isn't interested in it. What are some things you can do to engage the key decision makers in IT? First and foremost, it's important to educate the leadership in an inclusive way. And what I mean by that is you really want to get them kind of involved in the process. Talk to them using the language they can understand, and framing the questions in a way that are meaningful and important to them. So in general, most executive leadership are not going to care about the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of the technology itself, in terms of what operating systems you're running, or in terms of what platform your website is hosted on. Those are the kinds of things that may be important in the IT planning process, but talking about IT in that way is not going to lead to greater buy-in from the senior leadership. You need to put it in terms that they understand. So if their primary concern is raising membership, you need to connect the dots between how IT is going to help with that problem or with that challenge. If they have a mandate from the board, you need to know what that is, and you need to understand how IT sort of relates to that. So, it's important to raise IT issues, but it's also important to frame them in a way that, speaks to the level of the executive leadership and to the concerns that they have. So that's important. It's also important to be patient and persistent. Don't think that you're going to have one meeting. Well, first of all, don't assume you're going to get that meeting right away. And when you do, don't assume that it's what you're trying to discuss with the leadership is going to sink in right away. In general, as with a lot of long-term initiatives or cultural changes, organizational change, it just takes time and it takes persistence. So don't give up on the process, but also don't be surprised if it takes a while. Nothing is nothing works like concrete examples, and so if you can walk your leadership through specific scenarios, that will really drive the message home. So one of the ways that this happens the most with our clients is when we're talking about backup systems. And if you start talking about, well, we need a tape drive and it's got an RPO of 1 day and an RTO of 2 days, you're not going to get anybody's attention. But if instead you say, well, right now the backup system in place, if it crashes, we'll be down for 2 weeks. And chances, there's a good chance that we'll lose all of the data over 1 month old. So, and at first someone might say, well, what are the chances of that happening? That's not likely to happen. But then you can start to use more specific examples, like, well, there's power outages, there's weather, extreme weather conditions. There's a lot of different things that can happen. So you want to tell some good stories. And all of this kind of gets back to the overall theme here, which is just engage with the leadership. Use other things to talk about technology rather than talking about the technology itself. One last word of caution: be sure to set realistic expectations. I think it's pretty common in the world of technology to assume that technology is going to solve all of our problems, to put hopes and expectations on a new system that are just not realistic, to assume that a website development project, for example, is going to take the amount of time that you plan for it to take. Chances are it's probably going to take longer, just because that's how those projects often go. So be sure that when you're talking to the leadership, you want to convince them that what you're advocating for, what you're trying to plan for, is valuable and worthwhile. But at the same time, you don't want to oversell technology, because by doing that, you're just kind of shooting yourself in the foot for next year's planning process, and you're kind of leaving a bad taste in everyone's mouth when it comes to technology. So that's very important. I'm curious here how engaged your leadership is in IT decision making. So we'll do a little poll here. All right, good. So we got, that's good. It looks like there's one person out there who does not have leadership engaged in IT decision making. The majority are, it's kind of split almost really between very engaged and somewhat engaged. So that's great, great to see. And I think that also kind of reflects a trend that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, if not longer, of nonprofit leadership becoming more engaged in IT and understanding the importance and the value of IT. So assuming you have the governance pieces in place, the next step in the process is to prioritize, and that kind of boils down to strategy. So how are you going to prioritize the variety of technology initiatives that you need to move forward with in the coming year? And you can think about the strategic plan and the priorities in 2 ways. What do you need to do to maintain the status quo? And then what do you need to do on the IT side to keep up with any changes that are happening in the organization? So, for better or for worse, technology requires a certain amount of ongoing investment in order to run effectively over time. And that's kind of, what the status quo is. And so you need to make sure that you're planning for that on an ongoing basis. But then oftentimes organizations in their organizational strategic plan will anticipate or plan for changes that might change the number of staff, might change the types of programs that the organization is engaged in could change the locations where they're delivering service or trying to advocate, accomplish their mission. It could change the type of constituents they're reaching out to. And all of these things could have a significant impact on the type of IT that is being used by the organization. So it's really important as you begin the IT planning process to consider the strategic plans of the organization. So we're going to have another poll. We're curious how many of you out there have a strategic organizational plan? All right, so about three-quarters have a strategic organizational plan, about a quarter do not. So if you're in the group that has one, I strongly encourage you to get a copy of that and review it. And that's also a great tool for you to use in engaging your leadership. So if leadership is not engaged with IT, the strategic plan is something that they're hopefully very engaged with. And you can use that to kind of put together talking points and, a way to approach your staff. If your organization does not have a strategic plan, then at the very least, what I would suggest is, going to someone who in the leadership role and just asking them, well, what are your priorities? Like, what are you focused on this year? What's the organization focused on in the next 2 to 3 years? How do you see things changing? And we'll often ask that question when we start an engagement. And it's just good to know. That's very helpful information to have as you begin the IT planning process. So we're going to do another quick poll here. We're just curious if you have a strategic IT plan. So your organization might have a strategic plan for the organization. What about the technology function? Do you have a strategic plan for technology? All right, it's flipped. This time around, we have about three-quarters. And hopefully, this time around, we have about three-quarters that don't have a strategic IT plan and 1/4 that do. And I think that's pretty common. I mean, generally, the organization puts a lot of effort into coming up with its strategic plan, but not as much effort into coming up with the strategic technology plan. And I think this is an area where if you're responsible for the IT in the organization, it kind of falls on you to put this the strategic IT plan together. And you want to use the strategic organizational plan as a starting point, and then kind of going back to the question of what's changing and what's remaining the same is a nice starting point for putting together that plan. So in order to answer that question, the next step is to really assess what you have. How do you determine what you have now in terms of technology and whether it's currently meeting the organizational needs? So we always recommend going through some kind of assessment process. When you start that process, you need to know, what your capacity is for doing the assessment, whether you need to bring in someone from the outside or whether you want to bring in someone from the outside to do that assessment for you. If there's someone in the organization who owns IT, they can certainly be charged with putting an assessment together. And at the beginning of that process, once again, you want to make sure you set expectations about, the assessment and what will result from the assessment. Like what's the goal of doing an IT assessment? As part of the assessment process, it definitely helps to review the budget, the actuals from the previous year. So, how much did the organization budget for IT in the previous year? What was the actual spending like? And that can give you a good sense of, kind of what your run rate is for technology. And certainly for ongoing services like internet, that number should be pretty easy to get and to calculate. You want to talk to staff, if at all possible, as part of the assessment process. Technology in and of itself is obviously very interesting, but it really only has value to the extent that staff can use it to do their work. So you want to talk to staff as part of the assessment process and find out what's working for them and what's not working when it comes to technology. Now, this is an area where you do want to be a little bit careful, and we've all heard stories of, someone coming in and doing a thorough assessment process, and everyone gets interviewed and takes a long time, and then at the end of it, there's a report that's generated and then nothing happens with it. And that actually is worse in some ways than doing nothing at all, because you've raised a lot of expectations, you've created a lot of hype around a technology planning process that ends up not going anywhere. And as with any organizational change, you don't want to burn that capital completely, because the next time you come around talking about IT changes, the first thing out of everyone's mouth is going to be, oh yeah, I remember we did that 2 years ago and nothing came out of it. So you want to be very careful about sort of the PR implications, if you will, of doing these sorts of assessments, but they are very important to conduct. And related to that, you want to keep it going over time. You want to continue. Technology never stands still. Organizations don't stand still, and the technology systems that might have met your organization's needs 2 or 3 years ago, it's possible that they're not meeting those needs anymore. So it's important to keep the assessment going on an ongoing basis. So some of the different things that you can look at when you're doing the assessment are, I think, first and foremost, are your policies. And if you don't have any IT-related policies, that's definitely worth noting, and that's something that you want to incorporate into the IT plan. I think policy more now than before is probably on people's minds, largely because of BYOD, the bring your own device phenomenon that's sweeping the nation, is something that is catching a lot of people off guard, and not just small nonprofits, but large multinational corporations are struggling with this issue as well. And so, that's whether or not you allow staff to use their own device to do work, whether or not you require it. Those are all policy issues, and having a written policy that's built into the overall set of organizational policies is important. So you want to look at what policies you have now. Are they current? Are they up to date? And what do they specify? You want to look at your capacity. So does your organization currently have the technology capacity to do the work that it's doing? Internet is a great example of a technology that we don't think about very often. It's kind of just there, especially in this day and age. We just expect to have internet access all the time, everywhere we go. And what people don't realize is, or what they often don't realize, is that internet capacity is kind of a fixed quantity. So you bought that T1 line 7, 8 years ago. Well, the speed hasn't increased. The bandwidth of that T1 line hasn't changed. And unfortunately, the price hasn't changed either in the last 8 or 9 years. It's the same price you paid when you bought it. But your needs as an organization have definitely increased when it comes to bandwidth. With everything moving to the cloud, so to speak, with all of the multimedia, video, and graphics that are now available and kind of a standard part of using the internet, your typical T1 is no longer anywhere near the capacity you need it to be to do your work. And so, what ends up happening is people say, well, our internet's been getting slower and slower. Well, the reality is the internet hasn't. I mean, the speed has remained the same, but your needs as an organization have been changing. So you want to look at capacity as it relates to every aspect of your technology. Do you have the capacity for internet? What about drive space? Again, with the advent of multimedia files, communications, and fundraising departments starting to use video and high-definition photography a lot more than they used to, organizations are running out of space on their hard drives. And if you're running out of space on your hard drive, incidentally, you're also running out of space on your backups. And so there's all kinds of capacity issues that result from the amount of space that you're using on your network. Security, very important part. What is your security profile? Hopefully you have some basic security in place. Security is also related to policy. So security issues include things like making sure that you have a good firewall, making sure that you have good content filtering. And this is something that's not very popular, and usually when we bring it up with our clients, they immediately say, well, we don't want to be Big Brother. We're not trying to monitor what people are doing on the internet. But the reality is that email traditionally has been the #1 vector for viruses and malware getting into organizations. But that's no longer the case as much as it used to be. In fact, we had a client about a month ago who got a nasty virus. It took them 3 days to clean up their network. A good half of the organization, I would say, was basically unable to work for about 3 days. And that virus came into the organization through Skype. And so with the advent of a variety of different methods of communicating, like Skype, Dropbox, so forth, we're starting to see a lot more, a greater variety of vectors, and a lot of them are a lot less secured than email has essentially become. So, looking at, security from a lot of different perspectives is really important. I think a lot of small organizations sort of feel like, who cares about us? We're not, no one's going to try to hack into our network. And the reality is that most hacks are not targeted. Most hacks are kind of random hacking events. And whether someone is, deliberately or intentionally trying to do damage to your network, or, unintentionally trying to do damage to your network, the end result is the same, which is, loss of time and expense and cost of remediation. So definitely keep the security factors in mind. And then finally, don't forget staffing and support. That is also a critical part of any IT system. Keeping IT does take some amount of effort to keep it running, and you want to make sure you have, some support system in place for responding to staff requests, keeping the network, functional. So those are kind of 4 major categories that you can look at to when you're assessing your IT capacity. And if you hire someone from the outside to assess your IT capacity, make sure, your IT, where you status quo, make sure that they're looking at these different categories as well. Bring them your policies and say, hey, can you review our policies? So at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Matt, and he's going to talk a little bit about a simple, straightforward way of mapping your business process.
Yeah, thanks, Johan. I think we've had a really good background and primer on developing the IT assessment approach through looking at policies and kind of organizational capacity. So once you have those things out of the way, you have a good framework and understanding of your organizational culture, what things are important to your organization, do you expect to grow or change in the upcoming year or years. Then it really comes to a time where you need to look at what systems are in place now and how those systems may grow and evolve over time. So I like to use the simple enterprise architecture framework that helps to identify all the different business processes in an organization, and then look at those systems as how they kind of go through the organizational chart in terms of what application is being used by it, what platform that sits on, and then essentially what hardware. So it's also, I think, a good way to approach assessment looking first as the business process so that you can move it away from potentially that kind of technology view first. So this kind of helps you to ask those questions. Well, what's important to our organization? What business processes do we have? And then looking at the technology that supports them. And so, for example, let's take a look at this chart filled out. So, for example, most organizations, they'll have their business process. Email is going to be an important function. Perhaps right now that's using an Exchange server that sits on maybe a virtual server called org server 01, and then that sits on hardware that's a virtual server host. Kind of going along, file sharing, maybe that's your Windows file share, that's on a different server, and that's on a different physical host. Maybe you have a business process related to your CRM function, that's Salesforce, and that's out on the Salesforce cloud, and you don't have to necessarily worry about hardware. So this, I think, shows you a way to look at all of the components that are involved in that application stack. Obviously this doesn't show any potential interactions. Perhaps there's yet another business process or a function that links your CRM with your email system. And so if you're thinking that an upgrade or change to your email platform might be in place, well, then it's important to look at all of the contingent or tied platforms, so that if your email moves from your on-site Exchange server to Office 365, for example, you're able to still meet that same business process, but may require some changes, a new connector, a new service, something to tie those pieces together. So this is a great way to just start to map out and identify all the different things and start to look at the interconnectedness of the system. And I think particularly as we're seeing the shift from all the IT resources sitting in the server down the hall to different applications and services being introduced into the organization as part of various hosted cloud services, keeping something like this up to date can be important in just tracking your overall IT infrastructure, so that you can understand, oh yes, we have we're using Salesforce as our CRM, and then we're using Vertical Response for our messaging, and then that syncs up with our Google Apps account, but then we're also doing some document management, and help to just understand and keep all those interconnected systems aware of them, so that whenever the person who manages your Salesforce system leaves the organization, there's some degree of understanding of all of the the different constellation of services that are tied into that.
Thank you for joining Community IT for this podcast, Part 1. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits. Listen for Part 2 in your podcast feed.
Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.